A dense fog blanketed the city of Greyhaven as silence spread across its streets. The once bustling metropolis now lay eerily still, its towering skyscrapers casting long shadows over abandoned cars and flickering streetlights. The air carried a foul stench of decay, a grim reminder of the horror that had unfolded. A week ago, life had been normal. People went about their routines, unaware that something sinister lurked beneath the surface. It all started with a minor outbreak, news of strange, violent incidents in hospitals and police stations. At first, the government assured the public it was under control. But soon, the emergency broadcasts turned frantic. Then, they stopped altogether. Among the few who remained alive was Daniel Carter, a former paramedic with a sharp mind and a will to survive. He crouched behind an overturned bus, gripping a blood-stained crowbar, his heart pounding in his chest. Beside him, Lucy Ramirez, a resourceful journalist, checked her ammunition. Their supplies were running low, and if they didn't find shelter soon, they wouldn't last the night. The groans of the undead echoed through the streets. Shadows moved between the wreckage, eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. The virus hadn't just killed, it had transformed people into monsters. Mindless, relentless, and insatiable. "Over there," Lucy whispered, pointing to a dimly lit supermarket. Daniel nodded, and the two made their way cautiously, stepping over broken glass and abandoned belongings. As they entered, the stench of rotting flesh made Daniel gag. The aisles were ransacked, shelves emptied by desperate survivors long gone. Suddenly, a noise. A rustling from the back. Lucy raised her pistol. Daniel tightened his grip on the crowbar. A young girl emerged from the shadows, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't have been older than 10. "Please, help me," she whimpered. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He moved towards her, but before he could ask questions, the ceiling vent above them crashed open. A zombie lunged, its rotting jaws snapping inches from Daniel's face. He barely dodged as Lucy fired, the gunshot echoing through the empty store. The creature collapsed, but the noise had drawn attention. From outside, the groaning intensified. More were coming. This was only the beginning. The gunshot still echoed through the supermarket as Daniel, Lucy, and the terrified young girl froze in place. A few seconds passed, then came the inevitable response. A deafening chorus of groans erupted outside. The undead had heard the shot. Daniel rushed to the broken window. His stomach twisted at the sight, shadows moved between wrecked cars, shambling toward the store. Dozens of them. Maybe more. "We need to move," he hissed. Lucy grabbed the little girl's arm. "What's your name?" she asked quickly. "Ava," the girl stammered. "All right, Ava," Lucy said, forcing calm into her voice. "We're getting out of here, but you have to stay quiet, okay?" Ava nodded, her small hands trembling. The trio moved fast, weaving through the broken aisles toward the emergency exit. Daniel pushed the door open and peeked outside, an empty alley. "Clear," he whispered. They slipped out into the cold night air, hearts pounding. The streets beyond were swarming with zombies, their lifeless eyes scanning the darkness. The supermarket's front entrance rattled as the horde clawed at it, desperate to get in. Lucy clenched her jaw. "If they realize we're back here." "They won't," Daniel cut in. "If we stay quiet and move fast." But fate had other plans. A sudden shriek pierced the night. It came from a nearby rooftop, a desperate cry for help. Daniel's eyes darted upward. A man stood on the roof of a gas station, waving frantically. He was surrounded, undead clambered up after him, pulling themselves onto the rooftop like a flood of corpses. "Help! Please," the man screamed. Ava whimpered. Lucy cursed under her breath. The zombies in the street stirred, their heads snapping toward the sound. The horde split, some remained at the supermarket, but others now turned toward the gas station. Daniel clenched his teeth. The man wouldn't survive. Not against that many. "We can't help him," Lucy whispered. Daniel didn't answer. His hands trembled around his crowbar. Then the man's screams were drowned out by growls. It was over. Silence followed. A chilling silence. Then, one of the zombies turned its head toward them. And it saw them. With a guttural roar, it charged. Run! Daniel shouted. The chase was on. The night air was thick with the scent of decay as Daniel, Lucy, and Ava sprinted through the alley. Their breaths came out in short, panicked gasps. The zombie that had spotted them was fast, too fast. Daniel had seen these types before. Most of the undead were slow, their rotting bodies barely able to keep up with their hunger. But some, fresh ones, were different. They moved with terrifying speed, driven by an unnatural rage. And now, one of them was chasing them. Daniel risked a glance over his shoulder. The creature tore through the alley, its tattered clothes flapping as it closed the distance. Its lips had been ripped away, exposing yellowed teeth in a permanent snarl. Faster! Lucy hissed. Ava struggled to keep up, her small legs moving as fast as they could. She tripped on a loose brick and let out a terrified cry as she hit the ground. Daniel skidded to a stop. The zombie was nearly on them. Without thinking, he turned and swung his crowbar with all his strength. The steel connected with the creature's jaw, sending it staggering backward. But it didn't fall. Lucy fired a shot. The bullet struck its shoulder, but the monster barely reacted. Head! Go for the head! Daniel shouted. Lucy aimed again. This time, the bullet tore through the zombie's skull. The creature froze, then collapsed in a heap. But the shot had cost them. The alley filled with guttural growls. More shadows moved at the entrance. Daniel's stomach twisted. The horde had found them. Go, he barked, grabbing Ava's arm. They burst out of the alley and into the open street. The undead swarmed behind them, their moans echoing through the night. Ahead, an old subway station entrance yawned open like a dark abyss. There! Lucy pointed. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pulled Ava down the cracked steps, Lucy right behind them. They plunged into darkness, the air growing damp and cold. The moans of the undead faded as they moved deeper into the tunnel. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they stopped. Daniel leaned against the grimy wall, trying to catch his breath. Ava sniffled, tears streaking her dirty face. Are we safe? She whispered. Lucy peered into the darkness ahead. For now. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow. We can't stay here long. We need to keep moving. Lucy turned to Ava. Where were you before we found you? The little girl hesitated, then pointed down the tunnel. My dad was taking me to the underground shelters. He said it was safe there. Daniel exchanged a glance with Lucy. Most shelters had fallen within days of the outbreak. But if there was even a small chance that one still held survivors. We'll check it out, Daniel said. They pressed on, their footsteps echoing through the abandoned station. Rat-infested train cars sat motionless on the tracks, graffiti-covered walls crumbling with neglect. Then, a noise. A shuffling sound. Daniel raised his crowbar. Lucy aimed her pistol. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Not a zombie. A man. He was gaunt, his clothes ragged, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. He raised trembling hands. Don't shoot, he rasped. I'm alive. Daniel didn't lower his weapon. Who are you? The man swallowed hard. My name is Grant. I was part of the shelter group. We thought we were safe down here. His voice cracked. We were wrong. Lucy tensed. What happened? Grant's eyes darted to the tunnel behind him. They got in. Everyone's dead. Ava whimpered, clinging to Daniel's arm. Grant stepped closer, desperation in his gaze. Please. You have to help me. I know another way out. Daniel hesitated. Then, another noise. Low, shuffling footsteps. The undead were here. And they weren't alone. The dimly lit maintenance tunnel stretched ahead, damp and suffocating. Every breath Daniel took carried the stench of mold, rust, and something worse, decay. The air was thick with it. Behind them, the shrieks of the undead still echoed from the subway station. They had escaped for now, but there was no telling how long that would last. Ava clung to Lucy's side, her tiny fingers trembling as she walked. The girl had been silent since their desperate escape over the train. Grant led the way, his movements stiff, shoulders tense. "This tunnel connects to the old emergency exits," he muttered. "We just have to keep moving." A metallic clang echoed through the darkness. Everyone froze. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. That sound hadn't come from them. Something else was here. Lucy turned, gripping her pistol. "What was that?" Grant swallowed hard. "We're not alone." Daniel scanned the tunnel walls. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water onto the grimy floor. A few feet ahead, a massive ventilation shaft sat open, the grated cover lying on the ground beside it. Something had come out of that vent. Ava whimpered, hiding behind Daniel's leg. Then, movement. A shadow flickered beyond the emergency lights. It wasn't shambling like a normal zombie. It was moving low, fast. Almost crawling. Daniel's grip tightened on his crowbar. "Everyone stay close." They edged forward. The silence was unbearable. Then, something lunged. A blur of rotten flesh and snapping teeth burst from the darkness, tackling Grant to the ground. He screamed. The thing was on top of him, its face half ripped away, its milky eyes bulging with hunger. It wasn't like the others. Its limbs were twisted, unnaturally long, as if the infection had mutated. Grant thrashed, barely holding the creature back. Lucy fired. The shot echoed like thunder in the tunnel. The bullet struck its shoulder. The creature barely flinched. "Headshot!" Daniel shouted. Another shot. This time, it hit its skull. Blood splattered as the creature twitched violently before going limp. Grant shoved the corpse off himself, panting. What the hell was that? Daniel studied the remains. Unlike the other zombies, this one's body was contorted, its bones misshapen, muscles bulging unnaturally beneath rotting skin. Lucy nudged it with her boot. That wasn't normal. Ava sniffled, eyes wide with terror. Are there more?" A cold realization settled over Daniel. "If there's one," he said, voice low, "there's more." A noise behind them. The vent. A rustling sound echoed from inside it. Then another. Then another. Daniel's blood turned to ice. From the darkness of the shaft, multiple glowing eyes appeared. They were surrounded. "Run," Lucy whispered. Then the creatures poured out. A guttural screech tore through the tunnel as the creatures burst from the ventilation shaft. Not zombies. Not exactly. Their bodies were twisted, bones protruding at odd angles, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Unlike the mindless undead, these things moved with terrifying speed, scrambling along the walls like insects. Their elongated fingers twitched, ending in jagged claws. Daniel had no time to think. "Run," he bellowed. Ava screamed as Lucy yanked her forward. Grant was already sprinting ahead, his breath ragged with panic. Daniel swung his crowbar as one of the creatures lunged. The impact cracked its skull, but it didn't die instantly, it thrashed violently, its deformed limbs twitching as if struggling against death itself. Then another lunged. Daniel ducked just in time. It slammed into the wall, snarling, its mouth stretching wider than any human should. There were too many. He turned and ran. The tunnel twisted into an old storage area, metal shelves toppled over and rusted tools scattered across the floor. The flickering emergency lights barely lit the way. "Where do we go?" Lucy shouted, dragging Ava forward. "Stairs." Grant pointed. At the far end of the room, a rusted metal staircase led to an upper platform. A faded exit sign glowed weakly in the dark. The creatures shrieked behind them, their clawed hands scraping against concrete. Daniel shoved Lucy ahead. Go! Get Ava up first. Lucy hoisted the little girl onto the first step just as Grant scrambled up behind them. Daniel turned, swinging his crowbar wildly to keep the creatures at bay. One swiped at him. Its claws tore through his jacket, barely missing his flesh. Daniel gritted his teeth and drove the crowbar straight into its head. This time, the thing spasmed and collapsed. But more were coming. He turned and sprinted up the stairs. The metal groaned beneath his weight, rust flaking off as he climbed. At the top, a heavy security door stood slightly ajar. Grant shoved his shoulder against it, grunting. It's stuck, he yelled. The creatures were nearly at the bottom of the staircase. Their glowing eyes flickered like hungry embers in the dark. Daniel grabbed Ava and thrust her into Lucy's arms. Keep trying. Grant pushed harder. The door screeched as it budged an inch. The creatures leaped. Daniel swung desperately. He caught one midair, sending it crashing back down the stairs, but another lunged past him, its claws raking against his arm. He roared in pain. Lucy fired, the gunshot echoing through the narrow space. The bullet hit the creature's neck, but it still writhed, refusing to die. The door finally gave way. Inside. Now! Grant bellowed. Lucy rushed through, pulling Ava with her. Daniel stumbled in next, blood dripping from his torn sleeve. Grant slammed the door shut just as the creatures threw themselves against it. Thud. The impact rattled the entire frame. Daniel braced himself against the wall, breathing hard. His arm burned, but he ignored it. Lucy reloaded her pistol, eyes wide. What were those things? Grant shook his head. Not just zombies. Something worse. Ava sniffled, burying her face in Lucy's chest. Outside, the creatures howled. And then... silence. Daniel exhaled shakily. They had survived. But for how long? The silence after the attack was almost worse than the chaos. Daniel leaned against the cold metal door, his breath ragged, the deep scratch on his arm stinging with each heartbeat. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to ignore the pain. The creatures had retreated, but why? The undead never gave up so easily. Ava was still trembling in Lucy's arms, her small body racked with quiet sobs. Grant paced back and forth, his fingers running through his unkempt hair. This is bad. This is really bad. Lucy shot him a glare. No kidding. She turned her attention to Daniel. Let me see your arm. Daniel hesitated, but Lucy had already grabbed his wrist, pulling his sleeve up. The scratch wasn't deep, but it wasn't superficial either. The torn flesh was red, angry-looking. Lucy frowned. You think these things can infect with just a scratch? Daniel exhaled. I don't know. I've only ever seen people turn from bites. Grant stiffened. What if this is different? His voice was barely above a whisper. Ava sniffled, staring at Daniel's arm with wide, terrified eyes. You're not gonna turn into one of them, right? Daniel forced a smile, even though his stomach was tight with unease. No, kid. I'm fine. Lucy didn't look convinced. She ripped a strip of fabric from her already torn shirt and tied it around his wound. Just in case. Grant rubbed his face. We need to get moving. This place is a tomb. If we stay too long, we're dead. Daniel pushed off the door, ignoring the way his head swam. Where does this lead? Grant motioned to the narrow corridor ahead. This used to be an old underground service route. Leads to another access tunnel and then to the surface. But what? Lucy narrowed her eyes. Grant sighed. Last time I was here, the way out was blocked. The ceiling caved in. We'll have to find another route. Daniel groaned. Of course it is. There was no other choice. The longer they waited, the worse their chances became. "Let's move." The corridor was damp and suffocating. The air smelled of rust, mildew, and something else, something rotten. Ava clung to Lucy as they walked, her small footsteps nearly silent. Daniel kept his crowbar tight in his grip. Every muscle in his body was tense. His arm burned, but he pushed through it. After a few minutes, they reached a fork in the path. 2 tunnels stretched into darkness. Grant sighed. "Left goes deeper underground. Right is where the cave-in was." Lucy adjusted her pistol. "So we go left?" Grant hesitated. Daniel noticed. "What?" Grant exhaled. "The left tunnel was where we lost people. Something was in there." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Great. So we pick between a dead end or a death trap." Ava whimpered. "I don't want to go in there." Daniel crouched beside her. "I know, kid. But we have to keep moving, okay?" Ava nodded weakly. Daniel looked at the others. "Left it is." They stepped into the unknown. The deeper they went, the worse the air became. A thick, wet stench clung to the walls. Then they saw it. Bones. Human bones. Scattered across the tunnel floor, gnawed clean. Ava made a strangled noise and buried her face in Lucy's jacket. Daniel's grip on his crowbar tightened. "Something's been eating down here." Grant swallowed hard. "I told you this place was bad." Lucy aimed her flashlight ahead. The tunnel sloped downward, the floor slick with moisture. Their footsteps echoed, swallowed by the dark. Then, a sound. Low. Wet. Breathing. Daniel froze. "Did you hear that?" Lucy nodded, her body tense. The sound grew louder. Then, from the darkness, something moved. A shape, hulking and grotesque. It was a zombie, or at least, it had been. But it was different. Its body was swollen, pulsing unnaturally, as if something inside it was alive. Its skin bulged and split in places, revealing raw muscle. It turned its milky eyes toward them, then it lurched forward. Daniel barely had time to react before it exploded. A thick, black mist erupted from its body. The air filled with a sickening stench. Daniel gagged, covering his mouth, but it was too late. The mist burned his lungs. Ava started coughing violently. Lucy yanked her back, eyes wide with panic. "Move!" The tunnel came alive. Shadows shifted as more of the creatures stirred in the darkness. They had walked straight into a nest. And now, they were trapped. The tunnel was filled with black, toxic mist. Daniel's throat burned as he coughed violently, his vision blurring. The moment the swollen creature had exploded, the air had turned thick with rot and decay, the scent so overpowering that his stomach lurched. Ava wheezed, clinging to Lucy, who held the girl's face against her chest to shield her from the poison. Grant staggered back, his hands covering his mouth, his eyes wide with horror. And in the darkness, the creatures moved. Low, guttural snarls echoed as twisted figures emerged from the shadows. They weren't just zombies. Their bodies were malformed, their skin bulging with tumors that pulsed as if something was alive inside them. Daniel knew if one of them exploded near them again, it would be over. "Run," he bellowed, grabbing Ava's hand. They bolted. Grant was ahead, pushing through the dark, his breath ragged. Lucy was right beside Daniel, holding Ava tightly as they ran through the deathly mist. The creatures chased them, their deformed limbs skittering against the tunnel walls. Some were fast, too fast for something that should have been dead. Daniel didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel them gaining on them. Then, a faint light ahead. A flickering emergency sign glowed weakly through the darkness. A heavy maintenance door stood partially open. "This way!" Grant yelled. He reached the door first and shoved it wide. Lucy sprinted through, dragging Ava inside. Daniel was seconds behind her. Then, as he leaped through the doorway, A clawed hand grabbed his ankle. A wave of sheer terror crashed over him as he felt the creature's grip tighten. He turned, swinging his crowbar down in pure desperation. The sharp end slammed into the creature's wrist, snapping bone. The monster screeched, its grotesque face twisted in rage as it stumbled back. Daniel yanked his leg free and dove inside. Grant shoved the door closed just as the creatures slammed into it. Boom! The entire door rattled. A second impact nearly knocked Grant off his feet. Daniel jumped up, throwing his weight against the metal. Lucy did the same, her face pale with panic. The creatures outside screeched and slammed into the door, their claws scraping deep grooves into the steel. Then, silence. The only sound was their own ragged breathing. Daniel exhaled slowly, his body trembling from the adrenaline. Ava sobbed quietly against Lucy's chest. Grant collapsed against the wall, his hands shaking. That was too close. Too damn close. Lucy wiped sweat from her forehead, her eyes dark. They think now. They plan. She looked at Daniel. These aren't just zombies anymore. Daniel swallowed hard. They're evolving. A long, heavy silence settled between them. Finally, Daniel turned to inspect their new hiding place. The room was a long-abandoned security outpost. Rusted lockers lined the walls, a cracked monitor flickered with static, and a set of stairs led upward, a possible exit. Daniel's eyes flicked toward Grant. You said this connects to the surface, right? Grant nodded weakly. It should. If we can get through the old tunnel system, there's an emergency ladder that leads to the city streets. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then we move. Now. They climbed the stairs cautiously. The silence was unnerving. After the chaos below, the stillness felt wrong. At the top, they reached another hallway, narrow, lined with old security doors. Some were locked, others slightly ajar. The group moved slowly, their footsteps barely making a sound. Then, a noise. A deep, wet gurgle. Daniel froze. The sound was coming from one of the open doors. Lucy raised her pistol. Grant reached for his knife. Daniel motioned for them to move forward. He stepped inside the room, gripping his crowbar tightly. The smell hit him instantly. Rot. Something lay on the floor, twitching. A man, or what was left of him. His body was bloated, covered in the same pulsating tumors as the creatures below. His mouth moved, but no words came out, just a faint, sickly gurgle. Daniel took a step back. He's infected. Lucy's face was grim. But not turning. Ava whimpered. What's happening to him? Daniel didn't have an answer. Then the man's eyes snapped open. His mouth stretched too wide, a black liquid dribbling down his chin. Then he started screaming. A horrible, high-pitched wail that made Daniel's blood run cold. It echoed down the hallway. And in the distance, something answered. A long, inhuman screech. Then another. Then dozens. Daniel's heart stopped. They heard him. Lucy's voice was barely a whisper. Daniel clenched his jaw. We have to go. Now. A crashing noise erupted from the lower level. Then, the sound of clawed feet scrambling up the walls. They were coming. From everywhere. Grant bolted for the end of the hallway. The exit ladder is just ahead. Daniel grabbed Ava and ran. The hall shook as the creatures swarmed, their shrieks filling the air. Then, a shape lunged from the darkness. Daniel barely had time to react before the creature slammed into him. He crashed to the ground, Ava slipping from his grasp. The monster was on top of him, its face too close, its breath hot and rancid. Its teeth parted. Daniel shoved his crowbar into its mouth just as it tried to bite down. The thing screamed. Lucy fired, the bullet tearing into its skull. The creature convulsed, then fell limp. Daniel shoved it off, gasping for breath. Go! Keep moving! Grant reached the end of the hall and wrenched a heavy door open. Beyond it, a ladder. Rusted, but still intact. Their way out. Daniel grabbed Ava, shoving her up first. "Climb, kid. Don't stop." Ava scrambled up the ladder, Lucy right behind her. Daniel turned. The creatures were pouring into the hallway. Dozens of them. Twisted, deformed, hungry. They sprinted forward. Daniel climbed as fast as he could, his muscles screaming in protest. Below, the creatures jumped, their claws scraping against the metal. The first one reached the ladder, its jagged teeth snapping inches from Daniel's boot. Daniel didn't hesitate. He kicked it, hard. The creature lost its grip and dragged 3 others down with it. A sickening crunch echoed from below. Daniel reached the top just as Grant wrenched the hatch open. Cold air rushed in. They had made it. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. As Daniel pulled himself onto the surface, he realized something. The city was silent. Too silent. And then, in the distance, a low, echoing growl. Something big had heard them. Something was coming. Cold night air rushed over them as Daniel hauled himself out of the underground hatch. His lungs burned from the effort, his muscles screaming in protest, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Ava gasped, shivering as Lucy pulled her close. Grant collapsed beside them, panting, his hands shaking. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were back on the surface. But something was wrong. The city was silent. Too silent. Daniel's heart pounded as he scanned the ruined landscape. Skyscrapers stood like skeletal husks against the moonlit sky, their glass shattered, their walls scorched. Streets were littered with abandoned cars, bodies long since decayed. But no movement. No shambling zombies. No signs of life at all. And then, a deep, thunderous growl rolled through the city. A sound so massive it seemed to shake the ground itself. Ava whimpered, gripping Lucy's hand. Grant swallowed hard. What was that? Daniel turned toward the sound, dread creeping up his spine. Something big. From the shadows of the ruined cityscape, a massive shape began to emerge. At first, it was hard to tell what it was. A silhouette moving between the wreckage. Then the streetlights flickered, casting a brief glow over its form. And Daniel's blood turned to ice. It was a zombie. But unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was colossal. Easily over 20 feet tall, its bloated, deformed body covered in twisted, pulsing masses of flesh. Its head was elongated, its jaw unhinged like a snake's, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. A deep, guttural snarl rumbled from its throat as it sniffed the air. And turned its milky, hollow eyes straight at them. Lucy took a step back, her voice barely above a whisper. "Run." The creature let out a deafening roar. And charged. Daniel barely had time to react before the ground shook beneath them. The monster's massive, clawed hand swung wildly, smashing through an abandoned bus like it was made of paper. "Move!" Daniel shouted, grabbing Ava and sprinting. Grant and Lucy were right behind him, their footsteps pounding against the cracked pavement. The monster lunged. Its enormous fist slammed into the street just inches behind them, sending debris flying. A shockwave knocked Daniel forward, but he kept his grip on Ava, shielding her from the impact. "Where do we go?" Grant shouted, panic rising in his voice. Daniel's eyes darted across the ruined city. Skyscrapers loomed ahead, some partially collapsed, others standing tall like ghosts of a forgotten world. Then he saw it. A parking garage. Its entrance was barely intact, half buried under rubble, but the lower levels might still be stable. "There!" Daniel pointed. The group veered toward the structure, pushing their exhausted bodies forward. Behind them, the creature roared again, its monstrous footsteps shaking the ground. They reached the parking garage just as the beast swung its arm again. Boom! The impact sent a shockwave through the air, shattering nearby windows and collapsing part of a building. Dust and debris rained down as Daniel and the others dove into the darkness of the parking garage. The world outside trembled as the creature roared in frustration. For now, they were safe. But not for long. The parking garage was dark, the air thick with dust and gasoline fumes. Rows of rusted, abandoned cars stretched into the gloom. Ava coughed, burying her face in Lucy's chest. Grant slumped against a car, running a hand down his face. That thing, what the hell was that? Daniel exhaled sharply. Something worse than what we've seen before. Lucy frowned. It's evolving. Just like the ones in the tunnels. Grant shook his head. How do you fight something like that? Daniel didn't have an answer. Then, a low rumble. The ground vibrated slightly. The creature was still searching for them. Lucy tightened her grip on her pistol. We can't stay here. Daniel nodded. There's got to be another way out. Grant stood, peering through the shadows. Parking garages usually have stairwells. We could try going higher. Daniel considered it. If they went up, they'd have a better view of the city. Maybe find a route to escape. All right, he said. Let's move. They climbed the stairwell cautiously. Each step creaked under their weight, the concrete walls cracked from years of neglect. When they reached the rooftop, the city stretched before them, silent, lifeless. But then, in the distance, something moved. Not zombies. Lights. Faint, flickering. A small cluster of them in the far distance. Lucy sucked in a breath. That's a settlement. Grant's eyes widened. There are still survivors. Ava gasped. People? Daniel's heart pounded. It wasn't much, but it was hope. Their next destination. Then, a new sound. A deep, inhuman growl. Daniel turned. And his stomach dropped. The massive creature was climbing the garage. Its deformed fingers dug into the concrete, pulling its bloated mass upward. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, its mouth stretching into a horrifying grin. Lucy cursed. It's learning. Grant grabbed Ava. We have to jump, now. Daniel's mind raced. The next rooftop was barely a few feet away, the gap between the buildings narrow but dangerous. The beast let out a furious roar. There was no time. Daniel ran. He sprinted toward the edge of the rooftop. And jumped. The wind rushed past him. For a moment, he was weightless. Then his feet hit solid ground. He rolled, absorbing the impact. Lucy landed beside him, clutching Ava, her breath ragged. Grant barely made it, hitting the edge and scrambling up. Behind them, the creature roared in frustration, unable to follow. For now, they had escaped. But as Daniel looked toward the distant lights, he knew the fight was far from over. They had found hope. But the monsters were getting stronger. And the worst was yet to come.